I want to spend a little bit of time talking about brain development because there's been a lot of research done in the last several years on the impact that trauma can have on the developing brain. And it's something that I think some folks are familiar with, but a lot of folks, this is really new information. And again, when we start to get into neurodevelopment, some of us have had biology, some of us haven't. Those of us that have had biology probably haven't had it for a really long time. And so what I've done is I've condensed this information into a couple of slides to give you an orientation into how our brain functions and operates and how trauma can have an impact on the developing brain, because this is one of these pieces that I think a lot of us, because we don't have exposure to it, we don't pay attention to it. And all of a sudden, when you start to realize that the experience of these children has actually altered the way their brains are structured and how they're developing, all of a sudden this idea of placing blame on negative behaviors doesn't really fit so well. And the idea of punitive discipline practices doesn't really fit so well, because a lot of these kids, because of their experience, are acting the way they're acting because they don't have another choice. Because not only does their experience shape it socially and emotionally, and they don't know better because they haven't seen any different, but they have essentially become hardwired to do what they need to do to survive. So, children are like wet cement. Whatever falls on them makes an impression. We talk about kids that soak up information like sponges. That's another one that's used a lot. But I like this quote because we have the capacity to shape the development of these kids, even these kids who have gone through really stressful and horrible traumatic experiences. We have the opportunity to reshape them. They are only doing what they know. And we're going to talk about what that looks like biologically now. We know that trauma's risk to development has a biological foundation. We're born with what researchers call potential brains. And sometimes I think people forget, because we talk about our biology and our brain structures and our chemistry, and we think, well, we've got all this stuff in there, and we're predispositioned to it. We're born with it, and this is the way this child is destined to act because it's how they're hardwired. That's not necessarily the case. What researchers talk about often is that we're born with potential brains. We are born with the bare minimum that we need to survive as an infant. So we're born with a heartbeat. We're born with lungs so that we can breathe. We're born with the sucking reflex so that we can eat. And we're born with the ability to cry so that we can get attention. In a healthy, developed infant, newborn, these are the four functions that they have. Everything else is really shaped by our experience. And we know that, and there's been a lot of talk and emphasis on rapid brain development and rapid growth in the early years of a child's life, particularly birth to 3, birth to 5. We know this is happening very, very early on. We know that the speed and the direction of the growth of the structures and the functions of our brains are shaped by our social and our emotional experiences. This is really important because we know there are critical periods for brain development, but we also know our brain is a living, breathing structure. It is always developing. You know, we're not all sitting here with dead brains right now. Our brains are still growing. So there's always the capacity to make change and rewire things that have been wired in a way that isn't going to be adaptive for a child. So when living in complex trauma, the brain basically starts to activate in what we call basically a fearful state. And that's because these kids are always anticipating danger. This is the fight or flight stuff. So they're scanning, they're scanning, they're scanning, they're looking for danger, they're looking how to avoid danger. That's the way our brains are typically responding when we're exposed to a traumatic environment. We know that the parts of our brain that develop the largest and the fastest are going to be the parts that are activated the most. They're the ones that are receiving the most stimulation. So when you think about your brain, you think about in the most basic sense, the left side of your brain is your cognitive brain. This is your thinking brain. And your right side of your brain is your emotional brain. This is your feeling brain. Kids that are experiencing trauma typically have overactive and overdeveloped cognitive areas of their brain. Their left brain develops faster than their right brain because the emotional stuff is too hard to deal with. First of all, they're getting very mixed messages about healthy emotions. They're typically not exposed to them. They have a hard time expressing emotions because the stuff that they've gone through and that they've experienced is so difficult that they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know what healthy emotional nonverbal expression looks like. And so those parts of their brain are underdeveloped. And so what that ends up looking like is that these kids often don't have emotions present, or they show up in really incongruent, kind of strange ways that are inconsistent with what we would expect for them in terms of their behavior. You know, this is just like if you're going to the gym and you're working out and you're doing bicep curls on your right side and you don't do them on your left, this muscle is going to get a lot bigger. That's what happens to kids who are living in complex traumatic environments. So their brain is not developing optimally. You know, we don't have a balance between emotions and cognition. And we need to take that into account when we start talking about how do we talk to these kids, how do we interact with them, how do we create relationship with them. Okay. So we know that trauma can interfere with differentiation of brain development based on the severity of the child differences. So this is where things like the age of the child, their temperament, their personality, all of these things are going to start to play a role in their experience and subsequently development of their brain structures. We're talking about both gross and subtle changes. We're talking about large structures, and we're talking about the way those structures communicate with each other. We also see changes in neuroendocrine system responses. So these are stress hormones particularly, and we're going to talk about stress hormones in just a second. And we're going to talk about how trauma interferes with the brain's coordination of understanding, reacting to, and acting in relationships. This is how our brain communicates with other parts of our brain. This is really important stuff because obviously this is going to affect language, it's going to affect memory, it's going to affect problem solving. All of these different areas that are growing and developing are going to be underdeveloped in kids who are experiencing trauma. How many of you have seen this slide before? A few of you, okay, good. So what the slide is demonstrating is, on the left, a healthy child with a normally developing brain, and on the right, a child who's experienced extreme neglect. Now, you know, just to clarify, there's not a difference in age or size of these children. These are kids who are comparable in size, but you can see that the neglected brain is much smaller because it is underdeveloped. There's been a lot of research that has been done looking at brain scans of children who have been abused and neglected. And what they see is that in children who are maltreated, there's not only a lack of activity, but in many cases a complete void or emptiness in the frontotemporal regions of the brain. So we're talking about frontotemporal, this whole section of your cortex. And particularly in children who have been extremely neglected, and there's been a lot of research done, particularly in children who are living in orphanages in Eastern European countries and looking at their brain scans. Not only do their brains look like this, but when they do the brain scans where they can show, like, you know, basically heat-censored activation, they have places, huge pockets in this part of their brain that look completely dead. There is nothing happening. There is no activation at all. They are not stimulated whatsoever. So they're these big, usually you see it when you look at a picture of a brain scan, and there's some in the bigger packet. You see red and yellow and blue, talks about different levels of activation. And there are these big black holes that almost look like Swiss cheese in these kids who have been chronically neglected because their brains are not getting stimulated, and so the places that are not getting stimulated are not growing. So what is the impact of this? Why do we want to stimulate this part of your brain? Well, because it controls a lot of stuff. So We're talking about gross and fine motor function. We're talking about sensory input, memory, problem solving, language, judgment, impulse control, and pretty much all of your social behaviors come from right here. So if this part of your brain is not being stimulated and it's not developing, you can imagine the host of problems that these kids are going to encounter when they are expected to then go into an environment with a bunch of children who haven't experienced complex trauma, who are developing normally, who are at a huge advantage because their brains are probably larger and more sophisticated and more developed, and expected to do the same range of functions because we don't have a clue that they've been traumatized. Physically, they look the same. You put child A and child B next to each other, and one has been extremely abused and neglected and is going through all of this really awful stuff, and child B isn't. And physically, they might look exactly the same. One of the things to remember about the way that kids who are exposed to complex trauma respond to their environment and how they express outwardly what's going on to them is that not all kids who are traumatized will display the symptoms that we're going to be talking about. And not all kids that are not traumatized don't. So there are a lot of kids that might act out and might exhibit a lot of these behaviors that don't have anything going on with them. And then there are a lot of kids who have been extremely traumatized that we don't have a clue because they're presenting themselves in a way that looks like everything's fine. This gets to be really important because those kids and the way they're expressing what it is that they're expressing, both cognitively and emotionally, is going to be shaped by their experience from a very, very, very early age. Okay. So we know that the brain and hormonal systems are a single unified system, which means that the structures within our brain and the way our hormones in our body respond are going to depend entirely on each other. We use our central nervous system for threat appraisal. This triggers the threat response. This is the fight or flight stuff, or fight, flight, or freeze. Then our hormones kick in to response to prepare to that fight or flight. This is your survival mode. This is what am I going to do to get through this particular stressful moment. And then the left brain kicks in and we activate our thoughts and our cognitions to try to figure out planning for problem solving. So how do we get out of it? How do we get past this moment and get on to the next? So potential effects of trauma then become elevated stress hormone levels. And we talk particularly about adrenaline and cortisol when we talk about our hormones. There's a lot of hormones in our body, but these are the two that we're really going to focus in on. We know that sustained stress hormones are correlated with trauma-related reductions in brain function of the limbic system, of the hypothalamus, and of the hippocampus. These are things that are responsible for threat appraisal, stress regulation, memory, cognition, and learning. Kids who are impacted by complex trauma live their lives in a constant state of hyperarousal because they're always scanning their world for danger, and they're always trying to anticipate the next bad thing that's going to happen and how they're going to get through that next bad thing. Which means that kids who are living in complex traumatic environments oftentimes have elevated stress hormone levels. Now, this can be adaptive because obviously this is what triggers our fight or flight response. And we've all had this happen. So you've been in some kind of intense situation, you're really scared or you're really stressed out, adrenaline and cortisol go up, helps you prepare for whatever it is you're doing, and then you get through the stressful event and you come down. And usually when you come down, you're tired. But this can be adaptive, and this is something that happens for all of us, you know, on a fairly regular basis. We get stressed out, something happens, we're on alert, whatever that stress is passes, and we come down. Well, these kids who are living in these environments, they don't ever get the luxury of coming down. They're always up there all the time. And even though they're trying to manage in other environments where it might be safe for them or it might be okay for them to come down, they don't know how to come down because they're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. So what are the implications of living in a chronic state of stress? Well, obviously, we don't do a lot of research on us about that, but there have been a lot of animal studies that have been done. And in animal studies, overproduction of cortisol has actually killed nerve cells in the brain and can permanently damage and in some cases completely stop development of structures in the brain. So think about that for a second. You have a child who's living in a chronic state of stress, and they are constantly in this state of hyperarousal, and they're constantly overproducing adrenaline and overproducing cortisol. Probably not going to be maximizing development of the structures of their brain. Not only are they not going to be able to focus on a lot of the things that we would want them to be focusing on, but on a fairly regular basis, that's actually killing nerve cells. Now think for a second about a woman who happens to be living in a severe domestic violence situation, who is abused on a regular basis, who because of her situation is in a constant state of hyperarousal, and we know this from work that's been done with domestic violence victims, that typically they're always up here because their environment is very unpredictable. They don't know what to expect. So they're overproducing adrenaline and cortisol all the time because of where they're living. And now think about the fact that that woman happens to be pregnant. What is happening to the developing fetus that is now being pumped full of a whole bunch of adrenaline and a whole bunch of cortisol for 9 months? Right at the beginning of their life, they are at a huge disadvantage because their body has now been basically conditioned to react this way. And anything that could be developing in those structures has not been developing at the pace or the rate that we would expect for a child who's developing healthy and who's not in that situation. So you start to think about impacts. You can take this all the way back. Okay, go ahead. So additional potential effects, we talked about what's going on with the cortex. So trauma can then impact our verbal skills, our memory, and our problem solving. And we see this in children that have really hard time communicating. Their language skills and their emotions don't line up. They oftentimes have really a hard time with their memory. Short-term memory might be okay, long-term might not be, or the converse. And then problem solving. A lot of these kids don't get the opportunity to learn how to problem solve because they don't ever get to sit back for 5 minutes and try to figure out what it is that's really going on. And so they're constantly having to react to their world. So they never get the chance to stop, sit down, and actually think about, how am I going to do this differently next time? And that has huge implications into every domain. And then we oftentimes see an underdeveloped corpus callosum. And this is a structure that's basically right in the middle of your brain that allows your left brain to talk to your right brain. In some studies of abuse victims, we've seen up to an almost 20% reduction in the development of this particular structure. And if your corpus callosum is underdeveloped, then you're going to have a really hard time communicating. So your thoughts and your feelings are not going to necessarily sync up. Your emotional responses may be way out of line with what would be expected because your brain just isn't communicating with each other. So when you start to think about implications of trauma into language capacity and the ability for kids to express verbally, one, what might be going on for them, but two, why it is that they're reacting the way that they're reacting, they haven't developed the capacity to do that yet. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier into health outcomes and the impact of adverse childhood experiences on brain development. We know that the more that these events are happening, the more of a struggle it's going to be for these particular kids because their neurodevelopment has been altered. Which then when you start to think about a child that might be in your home or in your classroom that's acting out, you start to look at that acting out in a little bit of a different way, because again, you may not know exactly what's going on with that child. You may not know the big picture or the whole story. But oftentimes as adults, when we are involved with a child who's acting out behaviorally, who's disruptive or who's violent, and who's doing it in our setting, it's really easy for us to personalize it. And we either say that it's about me, or they're doing it to make me upset, or that there's something else going on. And this shows us that we need to take a step back and go, wait a minute, does this kid really have a choice? Have the structures actually been developed within their own internal physical systems to allow them to moderate the stress that they're going through so that they can respond in a healthy way? Probably not. Okay. So essentially what we know then is trauma primarily affects the biological systems beneath language and reasoning, and then secondarily affects the capacity to use language and reasoning as a balance to emotions. So once again, these kids don't develop their language centers in their brain, so they don't know how to use language appropriately, and they certainly don't know how to then make sense of the disconnect between what they're thinking and what they're feeling, or what you're thinking and what you're saying and what I'm hearing. They have a really, really hard time putting those two things together, which obviously then makes how they're reacting in terms of their behavior much more prominent and something that we need to pay attention to. Trauma also directly interferes with the basic role of loving relationships and healthy development. This goes back to the attachment piece. If you're living in a traumatic environment and you're not developing a healthy attachment, and you're not getting that emotional connection from the people in your caregiving environment, then those emotional centers in your brain are not going to be stimulated, and they're not going to be developed. All right. So if we're responding to trauma-related reactions, recognizing the biological basis of behavior in a child or adult means blame has no place. We have to start thinking all the way back to what's going on biologically in these kids, because there's such a focus on, one, identification of the symptoms and then treatment of the symptoms, that we're not going back to the foundation, we're not going back to the root cause of the problem. And so addressing the symptoms may be really helpful in the short term, but if you're not going back and addressing the cause and creating relationship with these kids so that they can learn the skills to do something different, then you're going to see those symptoms coming up over and over and over again because they don't know how to do it. Not only have they not been taught, but because they haven't been taught and they haven't had that experience, their brain has been rewired. And so we need to go back in and start giving them the capacity to change that. And we can do that because, again, our brains are always developing and growing, and we have the opportunity to create those connections and create activation where there hasn't been, and create relationship where there hasn't been, so that these kids can foster some resiliency. The other piece, I think, before we go on to self-regulation, is when you think about the approach that we have to intervention and to treatment in most of our systems, we do have this focus on looking at reduction of negative symptoms. And so oftentimes what happens is you have a child, let's say, that gets identified because they're acting out in the classroom and they're disruptive behaviorally and they're not paying attention. And that might be enough to generate a referral for some kind of assessment. So then the team gets together and they meet with the family and they meet with the teacher and they talk to the counselor, and maybe they make a referral, and everybody fills out their checklist. The teacher fills out their checklist and the parent fills out their checklist, and all of the symptoms line up to look like this child has ADD. And so they go to their doctor because, of course, we want to manage their symptoms, and they get prescribed medication to reduce the symptoms and the behaviors that are associated with this child's attention deficit disorder. And so the doctor prescribes them Ritalin, which, oh, by the way, is a stimulant. So you have a child who may or may not have attention deficit disorder, but who definitely has been traumatized, who is living in a constant state of hyperarousal, who is always way up here because their body is overproducing adrenaline and cortisol, and then we give them a stimulant. to manage their behaviors. I bring that up as an example not because I disagree with medicating children, because I think there's absolutely a time and a place where medication can be very effective. But there are huge implications around the biological basis for this behavior that are not coming up in our education system, and they're not coming up in our medical system. And so a lot of kids are getting referred for medication to moderate their symptoms. And I don't know about you guys, but when you go to your doctor and you have something going on physically, or you have a child that has something going on behaviorally, typically your doctor doesn't ask you about your childhood traumatic experiences. I mean, it's not something that's common practice. This is part of why we want to create this awareness about the implications of trauma and the impact it has on how we respond in all of our environments, because we are so symptom focused. And treating the symptoms is not going to get us back to understanding the root cause of the behavior and how that has impacted the neurodevelopment of this child, which means that we're not going to be able to get that child to do anything different, medication or not. So we have to start looking at how does trauma play a part? How do we create awareness and understanding with all the people that are involved in a child's caregiving system, whether that's within their family, within their school, within their doctor's office, within their church, within their neighborhood, within the mental health clinic that they're visiting, so that everybody is talking about it in the same way, so that we can create as complete a picture of this child's experience as possible, so that we can then put into place interventions that are going to be effective. Now, in the case that I mentioned, it probably wouldn't take very long to realize that a stimulant medication wasn't going to address the issue, because obviously if you're adding a stimulant into a kid that is constantly hyper-aroused because of what's going on in terms of their stress hormones, you're not going to have the same impact as you would with a child who clearly has something different going on biologically within the structures of their brain. So it's important that we pay attention to those things, and it's important that we try to get a complete picture of what's really growing. So there's always